Hey, Fire, how you doing?
Now, the smoke of the fire beat over towards me, and it must have made me heavy of a sudden. Moreover, the vapor of camphor was in the air. My fire would not need replenishing for an hour or so. I felt very weary after my exertion and sat down. The wood, too, was full of slumberous murmur that I did not understand. I seemed just to nod and open my eyes, but all was dark, and the Morlocks had their hands upon me. Flinging off their clinging fingers, I hastily felt in my pocket for the matchbox, and it had gone. Then they gripped and closed with me again. In a moment, I knew what had happened. I had slept, and my fire had gone out, and the bitterness of death came over my soul. The forest seemed full of the smell of burning wood. I was caught by the neck, by the hair, by the arms, and pulled down. It was indescribably horrible in the darkness to feel all these soft creatures heaped upon me. I felt as if I was in a monstrous spider's web. I was overpowered and went down. I felt little teeth nipping at my neck. I rolled over, and as I did so, my hand came against my iron lever. It gave me strength. I struggled up, shaking the human rats from me, and holding the bar short, I thrust where I judged their faces might be. I could feel the succulent giving of flesh and bone under my blows, and for a moment I was free. The strange exultation that so often seems to accompany hard fighting came upon me. I knew that both I and Weena were lost, but I determined to make the Morlocks pay for their meat. I stood with my back to a tree, swinging the iron bar before me. The whole wood was full of the stir and cries of them. A minute passed. Their voices seemed to rise to a higher pitch of excitement, and their movements grew faster. Yet none came within my reach. I stood, glaring at the blackness. Then, suddenly, came hope. What if the Morlocks were afraid? And close on the heels of that came a strange thing. The darkness seemed to grow luminous. Very dimly, I began to see the Morlocks about me, 3 battered at my feet, and then I recognized with incredulous surprise that the others were running in an incessant stream, as it seemed, from behind me and away through the wood in front, and their backs seemed no longer white, but reddish. As I stood agape, I saw a little red spark go drifting across a gap of starlight between the branches and vanish. And at that, I understood the smell of burning wood, the slumberous murmur that was growing now into a gusty roar, the red glow, and the Morlock's flight. Stepping out from behind my tree and looking back, I saw through the black pillars of the nearest trees the flames of the burning forest. It was the first fire coming after me. With that, I looked for Weena, but she was gone. The hissing and cracking behind me, the explosive thud as each fresh tree burst into flame, left little time for reflection. My iron bar still gripped, I followed in the Morlock's path. It was a close race. Once, the flames crept forward so swiftly on my right as I ran that I was outflanked and had to strike off to the left. But at last, I emerged upon a small open space, and as I did so, a Morlock came blundering towards me and past me and went on, straight into the fire. And now, I was to see the most weird and horrible thing, I think, of all that I beheld in that future age. This whole space was as bright as day with the reflection of the fire. In the center was a hillock or tumulus surmounted by a scorched hawthorn. Beyond this was another arm of the burning forest, with its yellow tongues already writhing from it, completely encircling the space with a fence of fire. Upon the hillside were some 30 or 40 Morlocks, dazzled by the light and heat, and blundering hither and thither against each other in their bewilderment. At first, I did not realize their blindness and struck furiously at them with my bar in a frenzy of fear as they approached me, killing one and crippling several more. But when I had watched the gestures of one of them groping under the hawthorn against the red sky and heard their moans, I was assured of their absolute helplessness and misery in the glare, and I struck no more of them. Yet every now and then, one would come straight towards me, setting loose a quivering horror that made me quick to elude him. At one time, the flames died down somewhat, and I feared the foul creatures would presently be able to see me. I was thinking of beginning the fight by killing some of them before this should happen, but the fire burst out again brightly, and I stayed my hand. I walked about the hill among them and avoided them, looking for some trace of Weena. But Weena was gone. At last, I sat down on the summit of the hillock and watched this strange, incredible company of blind things groping to and fro and making uncanny noises to each other as the glare of the fire beat on them. The coiling uprush of smoke streamed across the sky, and through the rare tatters of that red canopy, remote as though they belonged to another universe, shone the little stars. 2 or 3 Morlocks came blundering into me, and I drove them off with blows of my fist, trembling as I did so. For the most part of that night, I was persuaded it was a nightmare. I bit myself and screamed in a passionate desire to awake. I beat the ground with my hands and got up and sat down again and wandered here and there and again sat down. Then I would fall to rubbing my eyes and calling upon God to let me awake. Thrice I saw Morlocks put their heads down in a kind of agony and rush into the flames. But at last, above the subsiding red of the fire, above the streaming masses of black smoke and the whitening and blackening tree stumps and the diminishing numbers of these dim creatures, came the white light of the day. I searched again for traces of Weena, but there were none. It was plain that they had left her poor little body in the forest. I cannot describe how it relieved me to think that it had escaped the awful fate to which it seemed destined. As I thought of that, I was almost moved to begin a massacre of the helpless abominations about me, but I contained myself. The hillock, as I have said, was a kind of island in the forest. From its summit, I could now make out through the haze of smoke the palace of green porcelain, and from that I could get my bearings for the White Sphinx. And so, leaving the remnant of these damned souls still going hither and thither and moaning as the day grew clearer, I tied some grass about my feet and limped on, across smoking ashes and among black stems that still pulsated internally with fire, towards the hiding place of the time machine. I walked slowly, for I was almost exhausted as well as lame, and I felt the intensest wretchedness for the horrible death of little Weena. It seemed an overwhelming calamity. Now, in this old familiar room, it is more like the sorrow of a dream than an actual loss. But that morning, it left me absolutely lonely again, terribly alone. I began to think of this house of mine, of this fireside, of some of you, and with such thoughts came a longing that was pain. But as I walked over the smoking ashes under the bright morning sky, I made a discovery. In my trouser pocket was still some loose matches. The box must have leaked before it was lost. Part 13. The Trap of the White Sphinx. About 8 or 9 in the morning, I came to the same seat of yellow metal from which I had viewed the world upon the evening of my arrival. I thought of my hasty conclusions upon that evening, and could not refrain from laughing bitterly at my confidence. Here was the same beautiful scene, the same abundant foliage, the same splendid palaces and magnificent ruins, the same silver river running between its fertile banks. The gay robes of the beautiful people moved hither and thither among the trees. Some were bathing in exactly the place where I had saved Weena, and that suddenly gave me a keen stab of pain. And like blots upon the landscape rose the cupolas above the ways to the underworld. I understood now what all the beauty of the overworld people covered. Very pleasant was their day, as pleasant as the day of the cattle in the field. Like the cattle, they knew of no enemies and provided against no needs, and their end was the same. I grieved to think how brief the dream of the human intellect had been. It had committed suicide. It had set itself steadfastly towards comfort and ease, a balanced society with security and permanency as its watchword. It had attained its hopes to come to this at last. Once, life and property must have reached almost absolute safety. The rich had been assured of his wealth and comfort, the toiler assured of his life and work. No doubt, in that perfect world, there had been no employed problem, no social question left unsolved, and a great quiet had followed. It is a law of nature we overlook, that intellectual versatility is the compensation for change, danger, and trouble. An animal perfectly in harmony with its environment is a perfect mechanism. Nature never appeals to intelligence until habit and instinct are useless. There is no intelligence where there is no change and no need of change. Only those animals partake of intelligence that have to meet a huge variety of needs and dangers. So, as I see it, the upper world man had drifted towards his feeble prettiness, and the underworld to mere mechanical industry. But that perfect state had lacked one thing even for mechanical perfection: absolute permanency. Apparently, as time went on, the feeding of an underworld, however it was affected, had become disjointed. Mother Necessity, who had been staved off for a few thousand years, came back again, and she began below. The underworld, being in contact with machinery, which, however perfect, still needs some little thought outside habit, had probably retained perforce rather more initiative, if less every other human character than the upper. And when other meat failed them, they turned to what old habit had hitherto forbidden. So I say, I saw it in my last view of the world of 802,701. It may be as wrong an explanation as mortal wit could invent. It is how the thing shaped itself to me, and as that, I give it to you. After the fatigues, excitements, and terrors of the past days, and in spite of my grief, this seat and the tranquil view and the warm sunlight were very pleasant. I was very tired and sleepy, and soon my theorizing passed into dozing. Catching myself at that, I took my own hint, and spreading myself out upon the turf, I had a long and refreshing sleep. I awoke a little before sun setting. I now felt safe against being caught napping by the Morlocks, and stretching myself, I came down the hill towards the White Sphinx. I had my crowbar in one hand, and the other hand played with the matches in my pocket. And now came a most unexpected thing. As I approached the pedestal of the Sphinx, I found the bronze valves were open. They had slid down into grooves. At that, I stopped short before them, hesitating to enter. Within was a small apartment, and on a raised place in the corner of this was the time machine. I had the small levers in my pocket, so here, after all my elaborate preparations for the siege of the White Sphinx, was a meek surrender. I threw my iron bar away, almost sorry not to use it. A sudden thought came into my head as I stooped towards the portal. For once, at least, I grasped the mental operations of the Morlocks. Suppressing a strong inclination to laugh, I stepped through the bronze frame and up to the time machine. I was surprised to find it had been carefully oiled and cleaned. I have suspected since that the Morlocks had even partially taken it to pieces while trying, in their dim way, to grasp its purpose. Now, as I stood and examined it, finding a pleasure in the mere touch of the contrivance, the thing I had expected happened. The bronze panels suddenly slid up and struck the frame with a clang. I was in the dark, trapped. So the Morlocks thought. At that, I chuckled gleefully. I could already hear their murmuring laughter as they came towards me. Very calmly, I tried to strike the match. I had only to fix on the levers and depart then like a ghost. But I had overlooked one little thing. The matches were of that abominable kind that light only on the box. You may imagine how all my calm vanished. The little brutes were close upon me. One touched me. I made a sweeping blow in the dark at them with the levers and began to scramble into the saddle of the machine. Then came one hand upon me, then another. Then I had simply to fight against their persistent fingers for my levers, and at the same time feel for the studs over which these fitted. One, indeed, they almost got away from me. As it slipped from my hand, I had to butt in the dark with my head. I could hear the Morlock's skull ring to recover it. It was a nearer thing than the fight in the forest, I think, this last scramble. But at last, the lever was fixed and pulled over. The clinging hands slipped from me. The darkness presently fell from my eyes. I found myself in the same gray light and tumult I have already described. Part 14. The Further Vision. I have already told you of the sickness and confusion that comes with time traveling, and this time I was not seated properly in the saddle, but sideways and in an unstable fashion. For an indefinite time, I clung to the machine as it swayed and vibrated, quite unheeding how I went. And when I brought myself to look at the dials again, I was amazed to find where I had arrived. One dial records days, and another thousands of days, another millions of days, and another thousands of millions. Now, instead of reversing the levers, I had pulled them over so as to go forward with them, and when I came to look at these indicators, I found that the thousands hand was sweeping round as fast as the second hands of a watch into futurity. Very cautiously, for I remembered my former headlong fall, I began to reverse my motion. Slower and slower went the circling hands until the thousands one seemed motionless and the daily one was no longer a mere mist upon its scale. Still slower until the gray haze around me became distincter and dim outlines of an undulating waste grew visible. I stopped. I was on a bleak moorland, covered with a sparse vegetation and gray with a thin hoarfrost. The time was midday. The orange sun, shorn of its effulgence, brooding near the meridian in a sky of drabby gray. Only a few black bushes broke the monotony of the scene. The great buildings of the decadent men among whom it seemed to me I had been so recently had vanished and left no trace. Not a mound even marked their position. Hill and valley, sea and river, all under the wear and work of the rain and frost, had melted into new forms. No doubt, too, the rain and snow had long since washed out the Morlock suns. A nipping breeze stung my hands and face. So far as I could see, there were neither hills nor trees nor rivers, only an uneven stretch of cheerless plateau. Then, suddenly, a dark bulk rose out of the moor, something that gleamed like a serrated row of iron plates and vanished almost immediately in a depression. And then I became aware of a number of faint gray things, colored to almost the exact tint of the frost-bitten soil, which were browsing here and there upon its scanty grass and running to and fro. I saw one jump with a sudden start, and then my eye detected perhaps a score of them. At first, I thought they were rabbits or some small breed of kangaroo. Then, as one came hopping near me, I perceived that it belonged to neither of these groups. It was plantigrade, its hind legs rather the longer. It was tailless and covered with a straight grayish hair that darkened about the head into a Skye terrier's mane. As I had understood that in the Golden Age, man had killed out almost all the other animals, sparing only a few of the more ornamental, I was naturally curious about the creatures. They did not seem afraid of me, but browsed on, much as rabbits would do in a place unfrequented by men. And it occurred to me that I might perhaps secure a specimen. I got off the machine and picked up a big stone. I had scarcely done so when one of the little creatures came within easy range. I was so lucky as to hit it on the head, and it rolled over at once and lay motionless. I ran to it at once. It remained still, almost as if it were killed. I was surprised to see that the things had 5 feeble digits to both its fore and hind feet. The forefeet, indeed, were almost as human as the forefeet of a frog. It had, moreover, a roundish head, with a projecting forehead and forward-looking eyes, obscured by its lank hair. A disagreeable apprehension flashed across my mind. As I knelt down and seized my capture, intending to examine its teeth and other anatomical points which might show human characteristics, the metallic-looking object to which I have already alluded reappeared above a ridge in the moor, coming towards me and making a strange clattering sound as it came. Forthwith, the grey animals about me began to answer with a short, weak yelping, as if of terror, and bolted off in a direction opposite to that from which this new creature approached. They must have hidden in burrows or behind bushes and tussocks, for in a moment, not one of them was visible. I rose to my feet and stared at this grotesque monster. I can only describe it by comparing it to a centipede. It stood about 3 feet high and had a long, segmented body, perhaps 30 feet long, with curiously overlapping greenish-black plates. It seemed to crawl upon a multitude of feet, looping its body as it advanced. Its blunt, round head, with a polygonal arrangement of black eye spots, carried 2 flexible, writhing, horn-like antennae. It was coming along, I should judge, at a pace of about 8 or 10 miles an hour, and it left me little time for thinking. Leaving my grey animal, or grey man, whichever it was, on the ground, I set off for the machine. Halfway, I paused, regretting that abandonment, but a glance over my shoulder destroyed any such regret. When I gained the machine, the monster was scarce 50 yards away. It was certainly not a vertebrated animal. It had no snout, and its mouth was fringed with jointed dark-colored plates, but I did not care for a nearer view. I traversed one day and stopped again, hoping to find Colossus gone and some vestige of my victim, but I should judge the giant centipede did not trouble itself about bones. At any rate, both had vanished. The faintly human touch of these creatures perplexed me greatly. If you come to think, There is no reason why a degenerate humanity should not come at last to differentiate into as many species as the descendants of the mudfish who fathered all the land vertebrates. I saw no more of any insect colossus, as to my thinking the segmented creature must have been. Evidently, the physiological difficulty that at present keeps all the insects small had been surmounted at last, and this division of the animal kingdom had arrived at the long-awaited supremacy which its enormous energy and vitality deserve. I made several attempts to kill or capture another of the grayish vermin, but none of my missiles were so successful as my first. And after perhaps a dozen disappointing throws that left my arm aching, I felt a gust of irritation at my folly in coming so far into futurity without weapons or equipment. I resolved to run on for one glimpse of the still remoter future, one peep into the deeper abysm of time, and then to return to you and my own epoch. Once more, I remounted the machine, and once more, the world grew hazy and gray. As I drove on, a peculiar change crept over the appearance of things. The palpitating grayness grew darker. Then, though I was still traveling with prodigious velocity, the blinking succession of day and night, which was usually indicative of a slower pace, returned and grew more and more marked. This puzzled me very much at first. The alterations of night and day grew slower and slower, and so did the passage of the sun across the sky, until they seemed to stretch through centuries. At last, a steady twilight brooded over the earth, a twilight only broken now and then when a comet glared across the darkling sky. The band of light that had indicated the sun had long since disappeared, for the sun had ceased to set. It simply rose and fell in the west and grew ever broader and more red. All trace of the moon had vanished. The circling of the stars, growing slower and slower, had given place to creeping points of light. At last, some time before I stopped, the sun, red and very large, halted, motionless upon the horizon, a vast dome, glowing with a dull heat, and now and then suffering a momentary extinction. At one time, it had, for a little while, glowed more brilliantly again, but it speedily reverted to its sullen red heat. I perceived by this slowing down of its rising and setting that the work of the tidal drag was done. The earth had come to rest with one face to the sun, even as in our own time the moon faces the earth. Very cautiously, for I remembered my former headlong fall, I began to reverse my motion. Slower and slower went the circling hands until the thousands one seemed motionless, and the daily one was no longer a mere mist upon its scale. Still slower until the dim outlines of a desolate beach grew visible. I stopped very gently and sat upon the time machine, looking round. The sky was no longer blue. Northeastward, it was inky black, and out of the blackness shone brightly and steadily the pale white stars. Overhead, it was a deep Indian red and starless, and southeastward it grew brighter to a glowing scarlet where, cut by the horizon, lay the huge hull of the sun, red and motionless. The rocks about me were of a harsh reddish color, and all the trace of life that I could see at first was the intensely green vegetation that covered every projecting point on their southeastern face. It was the same rich green that one sees on forest moss or on lichen in caves, plants which, like these, grow in a perpetual twilight. The machine was standing on a sloping beach. The sea stretched away to the southwest, to rise into sharp, bright horizon against the wan sky. There were no breakers and no waves, for not a breath of wind was stirring. Only a slight oily swell rose and fell like a gentle breathing, and showed that the eternal sea was still moving and living. And along the margin, where the water sometimes broke, was a thick incrustation of salt, pink under the lurid sky. There was a sense of oppression in my head, and I noticed that I was breathing very fast. The sensation reminded me of my only experience of mountaineering, and from that I judged the air to be more rarefied than it is now. Far away, up the desolate slope, I heard a harsh scream and saw a thing like a huge white butterfly go slanting and fluttering up into the sky and circling, disappear over some low hillocks beyond. The sound of its voice was so dismal that I shivered and seated myself more firmly upon the machine. Looking round me again, I saw that quite near what I had taken to be a reddish mass of rock was moving slowly towards me. Then I saw the thing was really a monstrous crab-like creature. Can you imagine a crab as large as yonder table, with its many legs moving slowly and uncertainly, its big claws swaying, its long antenna like carters' whips waving and feeling, and its stalked eyes gleaming at you on either side of its metallic front? Its back was corrugated and ornamented with ungainly bosses, and a greenish incrustation blotched it here and there. I could see the many palps of its complicated mouth flickering and feeling as it moved. As I stared at this sinister apparition crawling towards me, I felt a tickling on my cheek, as though a fly had lighted there. I tried to brush it away with my hand, but in a moment it returned, and almost immediately came another by my ear. I struck at this and caught something thread-like. It was drawn swiftly out of my hand. With a frightful qualm, I turned and saw that I had grasped the antenna of another monster crab that stood just behind me. Its evil eyes were wriggling on their stalks. Its mouth was all alive with appetite, and its vast, ungainly claws, smeared with an algal slime, were descending upon me. In a moment, my hand was on the lever, and I had placed a month between myself and these monsters. But I was still on the same beach, and I saw them indistinctly now as soon as I stopped. Dozens of them seemed to be crawling here and there in the somber light among the foliated sheets of intense green. I cannot convey the sense of abominable desolation that hung over the world. The red eastern sky, the northward blackness, the salt Dead Sea, the stony beach, crawling with these foul, slow-stirring monsters, the uniform, poisonous-looking green of the lichenous plants, the thin air that hurts one's lungs, all contributed to an appalling effect. I moved on 100 years, and there was the same red sun, a little larger, a little duller, the same dying sea, the same chill air, and the same crowd of earthly crustacea creeping in and out among the green weed and the red rocks. And in the westward sky, I saw a curved, pale line, like a vast moon. So I traveled, stopping ever and again in great strides of 1,000 years or more, drawn on by the mystery of the earth's fate, watching with a strange fascination the sun grow larger and duller in the westward sky, and the life of the old earth ebb away. At last, more than 30 million years hence, the huge red-hot dome of the sun had come to obscure nearly a 10th part of the darkling heavens. Then I stopped once more, for the crawling multitude of crabs had disappeared, and the red beach, save for its livid green liverworts and lichens, seemed lifeless. And now it was flecked with white. A bitter cold assailed me. Rare white flakes ever and again came eddying down. To the northeastward, the glare of snow lay under the starlight of the sable sky, and I could see an undulating crest of hillocks, pinkish white. There were fringes of ice along the sea margin, with drifting masses farther out, but the main expanse of that salt ocean, all bloody under the eternal sunset, was still unfrozen. I looked about me to see if any traces of animal life remained. A certain indefinable apprehension still kept me in the saddle of the machine, but I saw nothing moving in earth or sky or sea. The green slime on the rocks alone testified that life was not extinct. A shallow sandbank had appeared in the sea, and the water had receded from the beach. I fancied I saw some black object flopping about on this bank, but it became motionless as I looked at it, and I judged that my eye had been deceived, and that the black object was merely a rock. The stars in the sky were intensely bright and seemed to me to twinkle very little. Suddenly, I noticed that the circular westward outline of the sun had changed, that a concavity, a bay, had appeared in the curve. I saw this grow larger. For a minute, perhaps, I stared aghast at this blackness that was creeping over the day, and then I realized that an eclipse was beginning. Either the moon or the planet Mercury was passing across the sun's disk. Naturally, at first I took it to be the moon, but there is much to incline me to believe that what I really saw was the transit of an inner planet passing very near to the Earth. The darkness grew apace. A cold wind began to blow in freshening gusts from the east, and the showering white flakes in the air increased in number. From the edge of the sea came a ripple and whisper. Beyond these lifeless sounds, the world was silent.
I'll be right
Silent?
back then with your dab.
It would be hard to convey the stillness of it. All the sounds of man, the bleating of sheep, the cries of birds, the hum of insects, the stir that makes the background of our lives, all that was over. As the darkness thickened, the eddying flakes grew more abundant, dancing before my eyes, and the cold of the air more intense. At last, one by one, swiftly, one after the other, the white peaks of the distant hills vanished into blackness. The breeze rose to a moaning wind. I saw the black central shadow of the eclipse sweeping towards me. In another moment, the pale stars alone were visible. All else was rayless obscurity. The sky was absolutely black. The horror of this great darkness came on me, the cold that smote to my marrow, and the pain I felt in breathing overcame me. I shivered, and a deadly nausea seized me. Then, like a red-hot bow in the sky, appeared the edge of the sun. I got off the machine to recover myself. I felt giddy and incapable of facing the return journey. As I stood, sick and confused, I saw again the moving thing upon the shoal. There was no mistake now that it was a moving thing against the red water of the sea. It was a round thing, the size of a football, perhaps, or it may be bigger, and tentacles trailed down from it. It seemed black against the weltering blood-red water, and it was hopping fitfully about. Then I felt I was fainting, but a terrible dread of lying helpless in that remote and awful twilight sustained me while I clambered upon the saddle. Part 15. The Time Travelers Return. So, I came back. For a long time, I must have been insensible upon the machine. The blinking succession of the days and nights was resumed. The sun got golden again. The sky blue.
And this
I
kinda-
breathed with greater freedom. The fluctuating contours of the land ebbed and
charged up
flowed.
today.
The hands spun backward upon the dials.
A little bit of
At
crown.
last, I saw
Little bit
again
of
the
dab.
dim shadows of houses, the evidences of decadent humanity. These, too, changed and passed, and others came. Presently, when the million dial was at 0, I slackened speed. I began to recognize
I don't
our
make
own
drinks
pretty
that
and
often,
familiar architecture. The
felt like
thousands
mixing it
hand
today.
ran back to the starting point. The night and day flapped slower and slower.
Plus, it
Then
helps me sleep.
the old walls of the laboratory came around me. Very gently now, I slowed the mechanism down. I saw one little thing that seemed odd to me. I think I've told you that when I set out, before my velocity became very high, Mrs. Watchett had walked across the room, traveling, as it seemed to me, like a rocket. As I returned, I passed again across that minute when she traversed the laboratory. But now, her every motion appeared to be the exact inversion of her previous ones. The door at the lower end opened, and she glided quietly up the laboratory, back foremost, and disappeared behind the door by which she had previously entered. Just before that, I seemed to see Hillier for a moment, but he passed like a flash. Then I stopped the machine and saw about me again the old familiar laboratory, my tools, my appliances, just as I had left them. I got off the thing very shakily and sat down upon my bench. For several minutes, I trembled violently. Then I became calmer. Around me was my old workshop again, exactly as it had been. I might have slept there, and the whole thing had been a dream.
That much crowd.
And yet, not exactly.
And
The thing
rest
had
was,
started from the southeast corner of the
what I mixed
laboratory.
with it.
It had come to
And
rest
ice.
again in the northwest, against the
So
wall
it's,
where you saw it. That gives you the exact
It's a
distance
stout one.
from my little lawn to the pedestal of the White Sphinx, into which the Morlocks had carried my machine. For a time, my brain went stagnant. Presently, I got up and came through the passage here, limping because my heel was still painful and feeling sorely begrimed. I saw the Pall Mall Gazette on the table by the door. I found the date was indeed today, and looking at the timepiece, I saw the hour was almost 8 o'clock. I heard your voices and the clatter of plates. I hesitated. I felt so sick and weak. Then I sniffed good, wholesome meat and opened the door on you. You know the rest. I washed and dined, and now I am telling you the story. Part 16. After the story. I know, he said after a pause, that all this will be absolutely incredible to you, but to me, the one incredible thing is that I am here tonight in this old familiar room, looking into your friendly faces and telling you these strange adventures. He looked at the medical man. No, I cannot expect you to believe it. Take it as a lie or a prophecy. Say I dreamed it in the workshop. Consider I have been speculating upon the destinies of our race until I have hatched this fiction. Treat my assertion of its truth as a mere stroke of art to enhance its interest. And taking it as a story, what do you think of it? He took up his pipe and began, in his old accustomed manner, to tap with it nervously upon the bars of the grate. There was a momentary stillness. Then chairs began to creak and shoes to scrape upon the carpet. I took my eyes off the time traveler's face and looked round at his audience. They were in the dark, and little spots of color swam before them. The medical man seemed absorbed in the contemplation of our host. The editor was looking hard at the end of his cigar, the sixth. The journalist fumbled for his watch. The others, as far as I remember, were motionless. The editor stood up with a sigh. "What a pity it is you're not a writer of stories," he said, putting his hand upon the time traveler's shoulder. "You don't believe it?" "Well, I thought not." The time traveler turned to us. "Where are the matches?" he said. He lit one and spoke over his pipe, puffing. "To tell you the truth, I hardly believe it myself, and yet—" His eye fell with mute inquiry upon the withered white flowers upon the little table. Then he turned over the hand holding his pipe, and I saw he was looking at some half-healed scars on his knuckles. The medical man rose, came to the lamp, and examined the flowers. "The gynoecium's odd," he said. The psychologist leaned forward to see, holding out his hand for a specimen. "I'm hanged if it isn't 1:45, said the journalist. "How shall we get home?" "Plenty of cabs at the station," said the psychologist. "It's a curious thing," said the medical man, "but I certainly don't know the natural order of these flowers. May I have them?" The time traveler hesitated, then suddenly, "Certainly not." "Where did you really get them?" said the medical man. The time traveler put his hand to his head. He spoke like one who was trying to keep hold of an idea that eluded him. "They were put into my pocket by Weena when I traveled into time." He stared round the room. "I'm damned if this isn't all going. This room and you and the atmosphere of every day is too much for my memory. Did I ever make a time machine or a model of a time machine? Is it all only a dream? They say life is a dream, a precious, poor dream at times, but I can't stand another that won't fit. It's madness. And where did the dream come from? I must look at that machine, if there is one." He caught up the lamp swiftly and carried it, flaring red, through the door into the corridor. We followed him. There,
right back.
in the flickering light of the lamp, was the machine, sure enough, squat, ugly, and askew, a thing of brass, ebony, ivory, and translucent glimmering quartz, solid to the touch, for I put out my hand and felt the rail of it, and with brown spots and smears upon the ivory, and bits of grass and moss upon the lower parts, and one rail bent awry. The time traveler put his lamp down on the bench and ran his hand along the damaged rail. "It's all right now," he said. "The story I told you was true. I'm sorry to have brought you out here in the cold." He took up the lamp, and in absolute silence we returned to the smoking room. He came into the hall with us and helped the editor on with his coat. The medical man looked into his face and, with a certain hesitation, told him he was suffering from overwork, at which he laughed hugely. I remember him standing in the open doorway, bawling good night. I shared a cab with the editor. He thought the tale a gaudy lie. For my own part, I was unable to come to a conclusion. The story was so fantastic and incredible, the telling so credible and sober. I lay awake most of the night thinking about it. I determined to go next day and see the time traveler again. I was told he was in the laboratory, and being on easy terms in the house, I went up to him. The laboratory, however, was empty. I stared for a minute at the time machine and put out my hand and touched the lever. At that, the squat, substantial-looking mass swayed like a bough shaken by the wind. Its instability startled me extremely, and I had a queer reminiscence of the childish days when I used to be forbidden to meddle. I came back through the corridor. The time traveler met me in the smoking room. He was coming from the house. He had a small camera under one arm and a knapsack under the other. He laughed when he saw me and gave me an elbow to shake. "I'm frightfully busy," said he, "with that thing in there." "But is it not some hoax?" I said. "Do you really travel through time?" "Really and truly, I do. And he looked frankly into my eyes. He hesitated. His eye wandered about the room. I only want half an hour, he said. I know why you came, and it's awfully good of you. There's some magazines here. If you'll stop to lunch, I'll prove you this time traveling up to the hilt, specimens and all. If you'll forgive my leaving you now. I consented, hardly comprehending then the full import of his words, and he nodded and went on down the corridor. I heard the door of the laboratory slam, seated myself in a chair, and took up a daily paper. What was he going to do before lunchtime? Then, suddenly, I was reminded by an advertisement that I had promised to meet Richardson, the publisher, at 2. I looked at my watch and saw that I could barely save that engagement. I got up and went down the passage to tell the time traveler. As I took hold of the handle of the door, I heard an exclamation, oddly truncated at the end, and a click and a thud. A gust of air whirled round me as I opened the door, and from within came the sound of broken glass falling on the floor. The time traveler was not there. I seemed to see a ghostly, indistinct figure sitting in a whirling mass of black and brass for a moment, a figure so transparent that the bench behind, with its sheets of drawings, was absolutely distinct. But this phantasm vanished as I rubbed my eyes. The time machine had gone. Save for a subsiding stir of dust, the further end of the laboratory was empty. A pane of the skylight had, apparently, just been blown in. I felt an unreasonable amazement. I knew that something strange had happened, and for the moment I could not distinguish what the strange thing might be. As I stood staring, the door into the garden opened, and the manservant appeared. We looked at each other. Then ideas began to come. "Has Mr. gone out that way?" said I. "No, sir. No one has come out this way. I was expecting to find him here." At that, I understood. At the risk of disappointing Richardson, I stayed on, waiting for the time traveler, waiting for the second, perhaps still stranger story, and the specimens and photographs he would bring with him. But I am beginning now to fear that I must wait a lifetime. The time traveler vanished 3 years ago, and, as everybody knows now, he has never returned. Epilogue. One cannot choose but wonder, will he ever return? It may be that he swept back into the past and fell among the blood-drinking, hairy savages of the age of unpolished stone, into the abysses of the Cretaceous Sea, or among the grotesque saurians, the huge reptilian brutes of the Jurassic times. He may even now, if I may use the phrase, be wandering on some plesiosaurus-haunted oolitic coral reef, or beside the lonely saline seas of the Triassic Age. Or did he go forward into one of the nearer ages, in which men are still men, but with riddles of our own time answered and its wearisome problems solved? Into the manhood of the race, for I, for my own part, cannot think that these latter days of weak experiment, fragmentary theory, and mutual discord are indeed man's culminating time. I say, for my own part. He, I know, for the question had been discussed among us long before the time machine was made, thought but cheerlessly of the advancement of mankind, and saw in the growing pile of civilization only a foolish heaping that must inevitably fall back upon and destroy its makers in the end. If that is so, it remains for us to live as though it were not so. But to me, the future is still black and blank, is a vast ignorance, lit at a few causal places by the memory of his story. And I have by me, for my comfort, 2 strange white flowers, shriveled now, and brown, and flat, and brittle, to witness that even when mind and strength had gone, gratitude and a mutual tenderness still lived on in the heart of man.
I'll be right back.
Book 2, The Island of Dr. Moreau. Introduction. On February the 1st, 1887, the Lady Vane was lost by collision with a derelict when about the latitude 1 degree south and longitude 107 degrees west. On January the 5th, 1888, that is, 11 months and 4 days after, my uncle, Edward Prendick, a private gentleman who certainly went aboard the Lady Vane at Callao and who had been considered drowned, was picked up in latitude 5 degrees 3 minutes south and longitude 101 degrees west in a small open boat, of which the name was illegible, but which is supposed to have belonged to the missing schooner Ipecacuanha. He gave such a strange account of himself that he was supposed demented. Subsequently, he alleged that his mind was a blank from the moment of his escape from the Lady Vane. His case was discussed among psychologists at the time as a curious instance of the lapse of memory consequent upon physical and mental stress. The following narrative was found among his papers by the undersigned, his nephew and heir, but unaccompanied by any definite request for publication. The only island known to exist in the region in which my uncle was picked up is Noble's Isle, a small volcanic islet and uninhabited. It was visited in 1891 by HMS Scorpion. A party of sailors then landed, but found nothing living thereon except certain curious white moths, some hogs and rabbits, and some rather peculiar rats. So that this narrative is without confirmation in its most essential particular. With that understood, there seems no harm in putting this strange story before the public in accordance, as I believe, with my uncle's intentions. There is at least this much in its behalf. My uncle passed out of human knowledge about latitude 5 degrees south and longitude 105 degrees east, and reappeared in the same part of the ocean after a space of 11 months. In some way, he must have lived during the interval, and it seems that a schooner called the Ipecacuanha with a drunken captain, John Davies, did start from Africa with a puma and certain other animals aboard in January 1887, that the vessel was well known at several ports in the South Pacific, and that it finally disappeared from those seas with a considerable amount of copra aboard, sailing to its unknown fate from Baina in December 1887, a date that tallies entirely with my uncle's story. Charles Edward Prendick. The story, written by Edward Prendick. Chapter 1. In the Dinghy of the Lady Vane. I do not propose to add anything to what has already been written concerning the loss of the Lady Vane. As everyone knows, she collided with a derelict when 10 days out from Callao. The longboat, with 7 of the crew, was picked up 18 days after by HM gunboat Myrtle, and the story of their terrible privations has become quite as well known as the far more horrible Medusa case. But I have to add to the published story of the Lady Vane another, possibly as horrible and far stranger. It has hitherto been supposed that the 4 men who were in the dinghy perished, but this is incorrect. I have the best evidence for this assertion. I was one of the 4 men. But, in the first place, I must state that there never were 4 men in the dinghy. The number was 3. Constans, who was seen by the captain to jump into the gig, luckily for us, and unluckily for himself, did not reach us. He came down out of the tangle of ropes under the stays of the smashed bowsprit. Some small rope caught his heel as he let go, and he hung for a moment head downward, and then fell and struck a block or spar floating in the water. We pulled towards him, but he never came up. I say, luckily for us, he did not reach us, and I might almost say luckily for himself, for we had only a small beaker of water and some sodden ship's biscuits with us. So sudden had been the alarm, so unprepared the ship for any disaster. We thought the people on the launch would be better provisioned, though it seems they were not, and we tried to hail them. They could not have heard us, and the next morning, when the drizzle cleared, which was not until past midday, we could see nothing of them. We could not stand up to look about us because of the pitching of the boat. The 2 other men who had escaped so far with me were a man named Helmar, a passenger like myself, and a seaman whose name I don't know, a short, sturdy man with a stammer. We drifted, famishing, and, after our water had come to an end, tormented by an intolerable thirst for 8 days altogether. After the second day, the sea subsided slowly to a glassy calm. It is quite impossible for the ordinary reader to imagine those 8 days. He has not, luckily for himself, anything in his memory to imagine with. After the first day, we said little to one another and lay in our places on the boat and stared at the horizon, or watched with eyes that grew larger and more haggard every day. The misery and weakness gaining upon our companions. The sun became pitiless. The water ended on the 4th day, and we were already thinking strange things and saying them with our eyes. But it was, I think, the 6th before Helmer gave voice to the thing we had all been thinking. I remember our voices were dry and thin, so that we bent towards one another and spared our words. I stood out against it with all my might, was rather for scuttling the boat and perishing together among the sharks that followed us. But when Helmer said that if his proposal was accepted, we should have drink, the sailor came round to him. I would not draw lots, however, and in the night the sailor whispered to Helmer again and again, and I sat in the bows with my clasp knife in my hand, though I doubt if I had the stuff in me to fight. And in the morning, I agreed to Helmer's proposal, and we handed halfpence to find the odd man. The lot fell upon the sailor, but he was the strongest of us and would not abide by it, and attacked Helmer with his hands. They grappled together and almost stood up. I crawled along the boat to them, intending to help Helmer by grasping the sailor's leg, but the sailor stumbled with the swaying of the boat, and the 2 fell upon the gunwale and rolled overboard together. They sank like stones. I remember laughing at that and wondering why I laughed. The laugh caught me suddenly, like a thing from without. I lay across one of the thwarts for I know not how long, thinking that if I had the strength, I would drink seawater and madden myself to die quickly. And even as I lay there, I saw, with no more interest than if it had been a picture, a sail come up towards me over the skyline. My mind must have been wandering, and yet I remember all that happened quite distinctly. I remember how my head swayed with the seas, and the horizon with the sail above it danced up and down. But I also remember as distinctly that I had a persuasion that I was dead, and that I thought what a jest it was that they should come too late by such a little to catch me in my body. For an endless period, as it seemed to me, I lay with my head on the thwart, watching the schooner, as she was a little ship, schooner rigged fore and aft, come up out of the sea. She kept tacking to and fro in a widening compass, for she was sailing dead into the wind. It never entered my head to attempt to attract attention, and I do not remember anything distinctly after the sight of her side, until I found myself in a little cabin aft. There's a dim and half memory of being lifted up to the gangway and of a big round countenance covered with freckles and surrounded with red hair staring at me over the bulwarks. I also had a disconnected impression of a dark face with extraordinary eyes close to mine. But that I thought was a nightmare until I met it again. I fancy I recollect some stuff being poured in between my teeth, and that is all. Chapter 2. The Man Who Was Going Nowhere. The cabin in which I found myself was small and rather untidy. A youngish man with flaxen hair, a bristly straw-colored moustache, and a dropping nether lip was sitting and holding my wrist. For a minute, we stared at each other without speaking. He had watery gray eyes, oddly void of expression. Then, just overhead, came the sound like an iron bedstead being knocked about and the low, angry growling of some large animal. At the same time, the man spoke. He repeated his question. "How do you feel now?" I said I felt all right. I could not recollect how I had got there. He must have seen the question in my face, for my voice was inaccessible to me. "You were picked up in a boat, starving. The name on the boat was the Lady Vane, and there were spots of blood on the gunwale." At the same time, my eye caught my hand, so thin that it looked like a dirty skin purse full of loose bones, and all the business of the boat came back to me. "Have some of this," said he, and gave me a dose of some scarlet stuff, iced. It tasted like blood, and made me feel stronger. "You were in luck," said he, "to get picked up by a ship with a medical man aboard." He spoke with a slobbering articulation, with the ghost of a lisp. "What ship is this?" I said slowly, hoarse from my long silence. "It's a little trader from Arico and Callao. I never asked where she came from in the beginning, out of the land of born fools, I guess. I'm a passenger myself from Arica. The silly ass who owns her, he's captain too, named Davies. He's lost his certificate or something. You know the kind of man, calls the thing the Ipecacuana of all the silly infernal names, though when there's much of a sea without any wind, she certainly acts according." Then the noise overhead began again, a snarling growl, and the voice of a human being together. Then another voice telling some heaven-forsaken idiot to desist. "You were nearly dead," said my interlocutor. "It was a very near thing indeed, but I put some stuff into you now. Notice your arm sore? Injections. You've been insensible for nearly 30 hours. I thought slowly. I was distracted now by the yelping of a number of dogs. "Am I eligible for solid food?" I asked. "Thanks to me," he said. "Even now the mutton is boiling." "Yes," I said with assurance. "I could eat some mutton. But," said he with a momentary hesitation, "you know, I'm dying to hear of how you came to be alone in that boat. Damn that howling!" I thought I detected a certain suspicion in his eyes. He suddenly left the cabin, and I heard him in violent controversy with someone who seemed to me to talk gibberish in response to him. The matter sounded as though it ended in blows, but in that I thought my ears were mistaken. Then he shouted at the dogs and returned to the cabin. "Well," said he in the doorway, "you were just beginning to tell me." I told him my name, Edward Prendick, and how I had taken to natural history as a relief from the dullness of my comfortable independence. He seemed interested in this. "I've done some science myself. I did my biology at University College, getting out the ovary of the earthworm and the radula of the snail and all that. Oh, Lord, it's 10 years ago, but go on, tell me about the boat." He was evidently satisfied with the frankness of my story, which I told in concise sentences enough, for I felt horribly weak. And when it was finished, he reverted at once to the topic of natural history and his own biological studies. He began to question me closely about Tottenham Court Road and Gower Street. Is Caplazzi still furnishing? Oh, what a shop that was! He had evidently been a very ordinary medical student and drifted incontinently to the topic of the music halls. He told me some anecdotes. Left it all, he said, 10 years ago. How jolly it all used to be. But I made a young ass of myself, played myself out before I was 21. I dare say it's all different now, but I must look up that arse of a cook and see what he's done to your mutton. The growling overhead was renewed so suddenly and with so much savage anger that it startled me. What's that? I called after him, but the door had closed. He came back again with the boiled mutton, and I was so excited by the appetizing smell of it that I forgot the noise of the beast that had troubled me. After a day of alternate sleep and feeding, I was so far recovered as to be able to get from my bunk to the scuttle and see the green seas trying to keep pace with us. I judged the schooner was running before the wind. Montgomery, that was the name of the flaxen-haired man, came in again as I stood there, and I asked him for some clothes. He lent me some duck things of his own, for those I had worn in the boat had been thrown overboard. They were rather loose for me, for he was large and long in his limbs. He told me casually that the captain was 3 parts drunk in his own cabin. As I assumed the clothes, I began asking him some questions about the destination of the ship. He said the ship was bound to Hawaii, but it had to land him first. Where? Said I. It's an island where I live. So far as I know, it hasn't got a name. He stared at me with his nether lip dropping and looked so willfully stupid of a sudden that it came into my head that he desired to avoid my questions. I had the discretion to ask no more. Chapter 3. The Strange Face. We left the cabin and found a man at the companion obstructing our way. He was standing on a ladder with his back to us, peering over the combing of the hatchway. He was, I could see, a misshapen man, short, broad, and clumsy, with a crooked back, a hairy neck, and a head sunk between his shoulders. He was dressed in dark blue serge and had peculiarly thick, coarse black hair. I heard the unseen dogs growl furiously, and forthwith he ducked back, coming into contact with the hand I put out to fend him off from myself. He turned with animal swiftness. In some indefinable way, the black face thus flashed upon me shocked me profoundly. It was a singularly deformed one. The facial part projected, forming something dimly suggestive of a muzzle, and the huge, half-open mouth showed as big white teeth as I had ever seen in a human mouth. His eyes were bloodshot at the edges, with scarcely a rim of white round the hazel pupils. There was a curious glow of excitement in his face. "Confound you," said Montgomery. "Why the devil don't you get out of the way?" The black-faced man started aside without a word. I went on up the companion, staring at him instinctively as I did so. Montgomery stayed at the foot for a moment. "You have no business here, you know," he said in a deliberate tone. "Your place is forward." The black-faced man cowered. "They won't have me forward." He spoke slowly, with a queer, hoarse quality in his voice. "Won't have you forward," said Montgomery in a menacing tone, "but I tell you to go." He was on the brink of saying something further, then looked up at me suddenly and followed me up the ladder. I had paused halfway through the hatchway, looking back, still astonished beyond measure at the grotesque ugliness of this black-faced creature. I had never beheld such a repulsive and extraordinary face before, and yet, if the contradiction is credible, I experienced at the same time an odd feeling that in some way I had already encountered exactly the features and gestures that now amazed me. Afterwards, it occurred to me that probably I had seen him as I was lifted aboard, and yet that scarcely satisfied my suspicion of a previous acquaintance. Yet how could one have set eyes on so singular a face, and yet have forgotten the precise occasion past my imagination? Montgomery's movement to follow me released my attention, and I turned and looked about me at the flush deck of the little schooner. I was already half prepared by the sounds I had heard for what I saw. Certainly, I never beheld a deck so dirty. It was littered with scraps of carrot, shreds of green stuff, and indescribable filth. Fastened by chains to the mainmast were a number of grisly staghounds who now began leaping and barking at me, and by the mizzen a huge puma was cramped in a little iron cage far too small even to give it turning room. Farther along the starboard bulwark were some big hutches containing a number of rabbits, and a solitary llama was squeezed in a mere box of a cage forward. The dogs were muzzled by leather straps. The only human being on deck was a gaunt and silent sailor at the wheel. The patched and dirty spankers were tense before the wind, and up aloft the little ship seemed carrying every sail she had. The sky was clear, the sun midway down the western sky. Long waves, capped by the breeze with froth, were running with us. We went past the steersman to the taffrail and saw the water come foaming under the stern and the bubbles go dancing and vanishing in her wake. I turned and surveyed the unsavory length of the ship. "Is this an ocean menagerie?" said I. "Looks like it," said Montgomery. "What are these beasts for? Merchandise? Curios? Does the captain think he's going to sell them somewhere in the South Seas?" "It looks like it, doesn't it?" said Montgomery, and turned towards the wake again. Suddenly, we heard a yelp and a volley of furious blasphemy from the companion hatchway, and the deformed man with the black face came up hurriedly. He was immediately followed by a heavy, red-haired man in a white cap. At the sight of the former, the staghounds, who had all tired of barking at me by this time, became furiously excited, howling and leaping against their chains. The black hesitated before them, and this gave the red-haired man time to come up with him and deliver a tremendous blow between the shoulder blades. The poor devil went down like a felled ox and rolled in the dirt among the furiously excited dogs. It was lucky for him that they were muzzled. The red-haired man gave a yawp of exultation and stood, staggering, as it seemed to me, in serious danger of either going backwards down the companion hatchway or forwards upon his victim. So Book 3, The Invisible Man, A Grotesque Romance. Chapter 1, The Strange Man's Arrival. The stranger came early in February, one wintry day, through a biting wind and a driving snow, the last snowfall of the year, over the down, walking from Bramblehurst railway station and carrying a little black portmanteau in his thickly gloved hand. He was wrapped up from head to foot, and the brim of his soft felt hat hid every inch of his face but the shiny tip of his nose. The snow had piled itself against his shoulders and chest, and added a white crest to the burden he carried. He staggered into the coach and horses more dead than alive, and flung his portmanteau down. "A fire!" he cried. "In the name of human charity, a room and a fire!" He stamped and shook the snow from off himself in the bar, and followed Mrs. Hall into her great parlour to strike his bargain. He took up his quarters in the inn. Mrs. Hall lit the fire and left him there while she went to prepare him a meal with her own hands. A guest to stop at Epping in the winter-time was an unheard-of piece of luck, let alone a guest who was no haggler, and she was resolved to show herself worthy of her good fortune. As soon as the bacon was well under way, and Milly, her lymphatic maid, had been brisked up a bit by a few deftly chosen expressions of contempt, she carried the cloth, plates, and glasses into the parlour and began to lay them with the utmost éclat. Although the fire was burning up briskly, she was surprised to see that her visitor still wore his hat and coat, standing with his back to her and staring out the window at the falling snow in the yard. His gloved hands were clasped behind him, and he seemed to be lost in thought. She noticed that the melting snow that still sprinkled his shoulders dripped upon her carpet. "Can I take your hat and coat, sir?" she said, "and give them a good dry in the kitchen?" "No," he said, without turning. She was not sure she had heard him, and was about to repeat her question. He turned his head and looked at her over his shoulder. "I prefer to keep them on," he said with emphasis, and she noticed that he wore big blue spectacles with side lights and had a bush side whisker over his coat collar that completely hid his cheeks and face. "Very well, sir," she said, "as you like. In a bit the room will be warmer." He made no answer, and he turned his face away from her again, and Mrs. Hall, feeling that her conversational advances were ill-timed, laid the rest of the table things in a quick staccato and whisked out of the room. When she returned, he was still standing there, like a man of stone, his back hunched, his collar turned up, his dripping hat brim turned down, hiding his face and ears completely. She put down the eggs and bacon with considerable emphasis and called, rather than said to him, "Your lunch is served, sir." "Thank you," he said at the same time, and did not stir until she was closing the door. Then he swung round and approached the table with a certain eager quickness. As she went behind the bar to the kitchen, she heard a sound repeated at regular intervals. It went, the sound of a spoon being rapidly whisked round a basin. "That girl," she said. "There, I clean forgot it. It's her being so long." And while she herself finished mixing the mustard, she gave Milly a few verbal stabs for her excessive slowness. She had cooked the ham and eggs, laid the table, and done everything, while Milly, help indeed, had only succeeded in delaying the mustard, and him a new guest and wanting to stay. Then she filled the mustard pot, and putting it with a certain stateliness upon a gold and black tea tray, carried it into the parlour. She rapped and entered promptly. As she did so, her visitor moved quickly, so that she got but a glimpse of a white object disappearing behind the table. It would seem he was picking something from the floor. She rapped down the mustard pot on the table, and then she noticed the overcoat and hat had been taken off and put over a chair in the front of the fire, and a pair of wet boots threatened rust to her steel fender. She went to these things resolutely. "I suppose I may have them to dry now," she said, in a voice that brooked no denial. "Leave the hat," said her visitor in a muffled voice, and turning, she saw that he had raised his head and was sitting and looking at her. For a moment, she stood gaping at him, too surprised to speak. He held a white cloth, it was a serviette he had brought with him, over the lower part of his face, so that his mouth and jaws were completely hidden, and that was the reason of his muffled voice. But it was not that which startled Mrs. Hall. It was the fact that all his forehead above his blue glasses was covered by a white bandage, and that another covered his ears, leaving not a scrap of his face exposed, excepting only his pink, peaked nose. It was bright, pink, and shiny, just as it had been at first. He wore a dark brown velvet jacket with a high, black, linen-lined collar turned up about his neck. The thick black hair, escaping as it could below and between the cross bandages, projected in curious tails and horns, giving him the strangest appearance conceivable. This muffled and bandaged head was so unlike what she had anticipated that for a moment she was rigid. He did not remove the serviette, but remained holding it, as she saw now, with a brown-gloved hand, and regarding her with his inscrutable blue glasses. "Leave the hat," he said, speaking very distinctly through the white cloth. Her nerves began to recover from the shock they had received. She placed the hat on the chair again by the fire. I didn't know, sir," she began, and she stopped, embarrassed. "Thank you," he said dryly, glancing from her to the door and then at her again. "I'll have them nicely dried, sir, at once," she said, and carried his clothes out of the room. She glanced at his white swathed head and blue goggles again as she was going out the door, but his napkin was still in front of his face. She shivered a little as she closed the door behind her, and her face was eloquent of her surprise and perplexity. "I never," she whispered. "There." She went quite softly to the kitchen and was too preoccupied to ask Milly what she was messing about with now when she got there. The visitor sat and listened to her retreating feet. He glanced inquiringly at the window before he removed his serviette and resumed his meal. He took a mouthful, glanced suspiciously at the window, took another mouthful, then rose and, taking the serviette in his hand, walked across the room and pulled the blind down to the top of the white muslin that obscured the lower panes. This left the room in a twilight. This done, he returned with an easier air to the table and his meal. "The poor soul's had an accident or an operation or something," said Mrs. Hall. "What a turn them bandages did give me, to be sure." She put on some more coal, unfolded the clothes horse, and extended the traveller's coat upon this. And they goggles, why, he looked more like a diving helmet than a human man. She hung his muffler on a corner of the horse. "And holding that handkerchief over his mouth all the time, talking through it. Perhaps his mouth was hurt too, maybe." She turned round as one who suddenly remembers. "Bless my soul alive," she said, going off at a tangent. "Ain't you done with them taters yet, Milly?" When Mrs. Hall went to clear away the stranger's lunch, her idea that his mouth must also have been cut or disfigured in the accident she supposed him to have suffered was confirmed, for he was smoking a pipe, and all the time that she was in the room, he never loosened the silk muffler he had wrapped round the lower part of his face to put the mouthpiece to his lips. Yet it was not forgetfulness, for she saw he glanced at it as it smoldered out. He sat in the corner with his back to the window blind and spoke now, having eaten and drunk and being considerably worn through, with less aggressive brevity than before. The reflection of the fire lent a kind of red animation to his big spectacles they had lacked hitherto. "I have some luggage," he said, "at Bramblehurst Station," and he asked her how he could have it sent. He bowed his bandaged head quite politely in acknowledgement of her explanation. "Tomorrow," he said. "There is no speedier delivery?" and seemed quite disappointed when she answered, "No." Was she quite sure? No man with a trap who would go over? Mrs. Hall, nothing loath, answered his questions and developed a conversation. "It's a steep road by the down, sir," she said in answer to the question about her trap, and then, snatching at an opening, said, "It was there a carriage was upsetted a year ago and more. A gentleman killed besides his coachman. Accidents, sir, happen in a moment, don't they?" But the visitor was not to be drawn so easily. "They do," he said through his muffler, eyeing her quietly through his impenetrable glasses. "But they take long enough to get well, don't they? There was my sister's son, Tom, just cut his arm with a scythe, tumbled on it in the hayfield, and bless me, he was 3 months tied up, sir. You'd hardly believe it. It's regular giving me a dread of a scythe, sir." "I can quite understand that," said the visitor. He was afraid one time that he'd have to have an operation. He was that bad, sir. The visitor laughed abruptly, a bark of a laugh that he seemed to bite and kill in his mouth. Was he said. He was, sir, and no laughing matter to them as had the doing for him as I had, my sister being took up with her little one so much. There was bandages to do, sir, and bandages to undo, so that if I may make so bold as to say it, sir— Will you get me some matches? Said the visitor, quite abruptly. My pipe is out. Mrs. Hall was pulled up suddenly. It was certainly rude of him after telling him all she had done. She gasped at him for a moment and remembered the 2 sovereigns. She went for the matches. Thanks, he said concisely as she put them down, and turned his shoulder upon her and stared out of the window again. It was altogether too discouraging. Evidently, he was sensitive on the topic of operations and bandages. She did not make so bold as to say, however, after all, but his snubbing way had irritated her, and Milly had a hot time of it that afternoon. The visitor remained in the parlor until 4 o'clock without giving the ghost of an excuse for an intrusion. For the most part, he was quite still during that time. It would seem he sat in the growing darkness, smoking in the firelight, perhaps dozing. Once or twice, a curious listener might have heard him at the coals, and for the space of 5 minutes he was audible pacing the room. He seemed to be talking to himself. Then the armchair creaked as he sat down again. Chapter 2. Mr. Teddy Henfrey's First Impressions. At 4 o'clock, when it was fairly dark and Mrs. Hall was screwing up her courage to go in and ask her visitor if he would take some tea, Teddy Henfrey, the clock jobber, came into the bar. "My sakes, Mrs. Hall," said he, "but this is terrible weather for thin boots." The snow outside was falling faster. Mrs. Hall agreed, and then noticed he had his bag with him. "Now you're here, Mr. Teddy," said she, "I'd be glad if you'd give the old clock in the parlour a bit of a look. 'Tis going, and it strikes well and hearty, but the hour hand won't do nothing but point at 6. And leading the way, she went across to the parlour door and rapped and entered. Her visitor, she saw as she opened the door, was seated in the armchair before the fire, dozing, it would seem, with his bandaged head drooping on one side. The only light in the room was the red glow from the fire, which lit his eyes like adverse railway signals, but left his downcast face in darkness, and the scanty vestiges of the day that came in through the open door. Everything was ruddy, shadowy, and indistinct to her, the more so since she had just been lighting the bar lamp, and her eyes were dazzled. But, for a second, it seemed to her that the man she looked at had an enormous mouth, wide open, a vast and incredible mouth that swallowed the whole of the lower portion of his face. It was the sensation of a moment, the white-bound head, the monstrous goggle eyes, and this huge yawn below it. Then he stirred, started up in his chair, put up his hand. She opened the door wide so that the room was lighter, and she saw him more clearly, with the muffler held up to his face just as she had seen him hold the serviette before. The shadows, she fancied, had tricked her. "Would you mind, sir, this man a-coming to look at the clock, sir?" she said, recovering from the momentary shock. "Look at the clock?" he said, staring round in a drowsy manner and speaking over his hand, and then, getting more fully awake, "Certainly." Mrs. Hall went away to get a lamp, and he rose and stretched himself. Then came the light, and Mr. Teddy Henfrey, entering, was confronted by this bandaged person. He was, he says, taken aback. "Good afternoon," said the stranger, regarding him, as Mr. Henfrey says, with a vivid sense of the dark spectacles, like a lobster. "I hope," said Mr. Henfrey, "that it's no intrusion." "None whatever," said the stranger, "though I understand he said, turning to Mrs. Hall, that this room is really to be mine for my own private use. I thought, sir, said Mrs. Hall, you'd prefer the clock. Certainly, said the stranger, certainly, but as a rule, I like to be alone and undisturbed. But I'm really glad to have the clock seen to, he said, seeing a certain hesitation in Mr. Henfrey's manner. Very glad. Mr. Henfrey had intended to apologize and withdraw, but this anticipation reassured him. The stranger turned round with his back to the fireplace and put his hands behind his back. And presently, he said, when the clock mending is over, I think I should like to have some tea, but not till the clock mending is over. Mrs. Hall was about to leave the room. She made no conversational advances this time because she did not want to be snubbed in front of Mr. Henfrey, when her visitor asked her if she had made any arrangements about his boxes at Bramblehurst. She told him she had mentioned the matter to the postman and that the carrier would bring them over on the morrow. You are certain that is the earliest, he said. She was certain, with a marked coldness. I should explain, he added, what I was really too cold and fatigued to do before, that I am an experimental investigator. Indeed, sir, said Mrs. Hall, much impressed. And my baggage contains apparatus and appliances. Very useful things indeed they are, sir, said Mrs. Hall. And I'm very naturally anxious to get on with my inquiries. Of course, sir. My reason for coming to Epping, he proceeded, with a certain deliberation of manner, was a desire for solitude. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. In addition to my work, an accident, I thought as much, said Mrs. Hall to herself, necessitates a certain retirement. My eyes are sometimes so weak and painful that I have to shut myself up in the dark for hours together, lock myself up. Sometimes, now and then, not at present, certainly, at such times, the slightest disturbance, the entry of a stranger into the room, is a source of excruciating annoyance to me. It is well these things should be understood. Certainly, sir, said Mrs. Hall, and if I might be so bold as to ask, that, I think, is all, said the stranger, with that quietly irresistible air of finality he could assume at will. Mrs. Hall reserved her question and sympathy for a better occasion. After Mrs. Hall had left the room, he remained standing in front of the fire, glaring, so Mr. Henfrey puts it, at the clock mending. Mr. Henfrey not only took off the hands of the clock and the face, but extracted the works, and he tried to work in as slow and quiet and unassuming a manner as possible. He worked with the lamp close to him, and the green shade threw a brilliant light upon his hands and upon the frame and wheels, and left the rest of the room shadowy. When he looked up, colored patches swam in his eyes. Being constitutionally of a curious nature, he had removed the works, a quite unnecessary proceeding, with the idea of delaying his departure and perhaps falling into conversation with the stranger. But the stranger stood there, perfectly silent and still, so still it got on Henfrey's nerves. He felt alone in the room and looked up, and there, grey and dim, was the bandaged hand and huge blue lenses staring fixedly with a mist of green spots drifting in front of them. It was so uncanny to Henfrey that for a minute they remained staring blankly at one another. Then Henfrey looked down again. Very uncomfortable position. One would like to say something. Should he remark that the weather was very cold for this time of year? He looked up as if to take aim with that introductory shot. The weather, he began. Why don't you finish and go, said the rigid figure, evidently in a state of painfully suppressed rage. All you've got to do is to fix the hour hand on its axle. You're simply humbugging. Certainly, sir. 1 minute more. I overlooked. And Mr. Henfrey finished and went. But he was feeling excessively annoyed. Damn it, said Mr. Henfrey to himself, trudging down the village through the thawing snow. A man must do a clock at times, surely. And again, can't a man look at you? Ugly. And yet again, seemingly not. If a police was wanting you, you couldn't have been more ropped and bandaged. At Gleason's corner, he saw Hall, who had recently married the stranger's hostess at the Coach and Horses, and who now drove the Ipping conveyance, when occasional people required it, to Sidderbridge Junction, coming towards him on his return from that place. Hall had evidently been stopping a bit at Sidderbridge, to judge by his driving. "How do, Teddy?" he said, passing. "You've got a rum un up home," said Teddy. Hall very sociably pulled up. "What's that?" he asked. "Rum-looking customer stopping at the Coach and Horses," said Teddy. "My sakes!" And he proceeded to give Hall a vivid description of his grotesque guest. "Looks a bit like a disguise, don't it? I'd like to see a man's face if I had him stopping in my place," said Henry. "But women are that trustful when strangers are concerned. He's took your rooms and ain't even given a name, Hall." "You don't say so," said Hall, who was a man of sluggish apprehension. "Yes," said Teddy, "by the week. Whatever he is, you can't get rid of him under the week. And he's got a lot of luggage coming tomorrow, so he says. Let's hope it won't be stones in boxes all." He told Hall how his aunt at Hastings had been swindled by a stranger with empty portmanteau. Altogether, he left Hall vaguely suspicious. "Get up, old girl," said Hall. "I suppose I must see about this." Teddy trudged on his way with his mind considerably relieved. Instead of seeing about it, however, Hall, on his return, was severely rated by his wife on the length of time he had spent in Sidderbridge, and his mild inquiries were answered snappishly and in a manner not to the point. But the seed of suspicion Teddy had sown germinated in the mind of Mr. Hall, in spite of these discouragements. "You whim don't know everything," said Mr. Hall, resolved to ascertain more about the personality of his guest at the earliest possible opportunity. And after the stranger had gone to bed, which he did about 9:30, Mr. Hall went very aggressively into the parlour and looked very hard at his wife's furniture, just to show that the stranger wasn't master there, and scrutinized closely and a little contemptuously a sheet of mathematical computations the stranger had left. When retiring for the night, he instructed Mrs. Hall to look very closely at the stranger's luggage when it came next day. "You mind your own business, Hall," said Mrs. Hall, "and I'll mind mine." She was all the more inclined to snap at Hall because the stranger was undoubtedly an unusually strange sort of stranger, and she was by no means assured about him in her own mind. In the middle of the night, she woke up dreaming of huge white heads, like turnips, that came trailing after her at the end of interminable necks, and with vast black eyes. But, being a sensible woman, she subdued her terrors and turned over and went to sleep again. Chapter 3, The 1,001 Bottles. So it was that on the 29th day of February, at the beginning of the thaw, this singular person fell out of infinity into Ipping village. Next day, his luggage arrived through the slush, and very remarkable luggage it was. There were a couple of trunks indeed, such as a rational man might need, but in addition, there were a box of books, big, fat books, of which some were just in an incomprehensible handwriting, and a dozen or more crates, boxes, and cases containing objects packed in straw, as it seemed to Hall, tugging with a casual curiosity at the straw, glass bottles. The stranger, muffled in hat, coat, gloves, and wrapper, came out impatiently to meet Fearenside's cart, while Hall was having a word or so of gossip preparatory to helping bring them in. Out he came, not noticing Fearenside's dog, who was sniffing in a dilettante spirit at Hall's legs. "Come along with those boxes," he said. "I've been waiting long enough." And he came down the steps towards the tail of the cart as if to lay hands on the smaller crate. No sooner had Fearenside's dog caught sight of him, however, than it began to bristle and growl savagely. And when he rushed down the steps, it gave an undecided hop and then sprang straight at his hand. "Whoop!" cried Hall, jumping back, for he was no hero with dogs, and Fearenside howled, "Lie down!" and snatched his whip. They saw the dog's teeth had slipped the hand, heard a kick, saw the dog execute a flanking jump and get home on the stranger's leg, and heard the rip of his trousering. Then the finer end of Fearenside's whip reached his property, and the dog, yelping with dismay, retreated under the wheels of the wagon. It was all the business of a swift half-minute. No one spoke, everyone shouted. The stranger glanced swiftly at his torn glove and at his leg, made as if he would stoop to the latter, then turned and rushed swiftly up the steps into the inn. They heard him go headlong across the passage and up the uncarpeted stairs to his bedroom. "You brute, you!" said Fearenside, climbing off the wagon with the whip in his hand, while the dog watched him through the wheel. "Come here," said Fearenside. "You better." Hall had stood gaping. "He was bit," said Hall. "I'd better go and see to him." And he trotted after the stranger. He met Mrs. Hall in the passage. "Terrier's dog," he said. "Bidden." He went straight upstairs, and the stranger's door being ajar, he pushed it open and was entering without any ceremony, being of a naturally sympathetic turn of mind. The blind was down, and the room dim. He caught a glimpse of a most singular thing, what seemed a handless arm waving towards him, and a face of 3 huge indeterminate spots on white, very like the face of a pale pansy. Then he was struck violently in the chest, hurled back, and the door slammed in his face and locked. It was so rapid that it gave him no time to observe. A waving of indecipherable shapes, a blow, and a concussion. There he stood on the dark little landing, wondering what it might be that he had seen. A couple of minutes after, he rejoined the little group that had formed outside the Coach and Horses. There was Fearenside telling about it all over again for the second time. There was Mrs. Hall saying the dog didn't have no business to bite her guests. There was Huckster, the general dealer from over the road, interrogative, and Sandy Wadgers from the Forge, judicial, besides women and children, all of them saying fatuities. "Wouldn't let him bite me on nose. 'Tisn't right to have such dogs. What are you biting for then?" And so on. Mr. Hall, staring at them from the steps and listening, found it incredible that he'd seen anything so very remarkable happen upstairs. Besides, his vocabulary was altogether too limited to express his impressions. "He don't want no help, he says," he said in answer to his wife's inquiry. "We'd better be a-taking of his luggage in." "He ought to have it cauterized at once," said Mr. Huckster, "especially if it's at all inflamed." "I'd shoot him, that's what I'd do," said a lady in the group. Suddenly, the dog began growling again. "Come along!" cried an angry voice in the doorway, and there stood the muffled stranger, with his collar turned up and his hat brim bent down. "The sooner you get those things in, the better I'll be pleased." It is stated by an anonymous bystander that his trousers and gloves had been changed. "Was you hurt, sir?" said Fearenside. "I'm rare sorry the dog—" "Not a bit," said the stranger. "Never broke the skin. Hurry up with those things." He then swore to himself, so Mr. Hall asserts. Directly the first crate was, in accordance with his directions, carried into the parlor, the stranger flung himself upon it with extraordinary eagerness and began to unpack it, scattering the straw with an utter disregard of Mrs. Hall's carpet. And from it he began to produce bottles, little fat bottles containing powders, small and slender bottles containing colored and white fluids, fluted blue bottles labeled poison, bottles with round bodies and slender necks, large green glass bottles, large white glass bottles, bottles with glass stoppers and frosted labels, bottles with fine corks, bottles with bungs, bottles with wooden caps, wine bottles, salad oil bottles, putting them in rows on the chiffonier, on the mantel, on the table, under the window, round the floor, on the bookshelf, everywhere. The chemist shop in Bramblehurst could not boast half so many. Quite a sight it was. Crate after crate yielded bottles, until all 6 were empty and the table high with straw. The only things that came out of these crates, beside the bottles, were a number of test tubes and a carefully packed balance. And directly the crates were unpacked, the stranger went to the window and set to work, not troubling in the least about the litter of straw, the fire which had gone out, the box of books outside, nor for the trunks and other luggage that had gone upstairs. When Mrs. Hall took his dinner into him, he was already so absorbed in his work, pouring little drops out of the bottles into test tubes, that he did not hear her until she had swept away the bulk of the straw and put the tray upon the table, with some little emphasis perhaps, seeing the state that the floor was in. Then he half turned his head and immediately turned it away again. But she saw that he had removed his glasses. They were beside him on the table, and it seemed to her that his eye sockets were extraordinarily hollow. He put on his spectacles again and then turned and faced her. She was about to complain of the straw on the floor when he anticipated her. "I wish you wouldn't come in without knocking," he said, in the tone of abnormal exasperation that seemed so characteristic of him. "I knocked, but seemingly—" "Perhaps you did. But in my investigations, my really very urgent and necessary investigations, the slightest disturbance, the jar of a door, I must—" "Oh, certainly, sir. You can turn the lock if you like that, you know, any time." "A very good idea," said the stranger. "This straw, sir, if I might make so bold as to remark—" "Don't. If the straw makes any trouble, put it down in the bill." And he mumbled at her words suspiciously like curses. He was so odd, standing there, so aggressive and explosive, bottle in one hand and test tube in the other, that Mrs. Hall was quite alarmed. But she was a resolute woman. "In which case, I should like to know, sir, what you consider—" "A shilling! Put down a shilling! Surely a shilling's enough." "So be it," said Mrs. Hall, taking up the tablecloth and beginning to spread it over the table. "If you're satisfied, of course." He turned and sat down with his coat collar toward her. All the afternoon he worked with the door locked and, as Mrs. Hall testifies, for the most part in silence. But once there was a concussion and a sound of bottles ringing together as though the table had been hit, and the smash of a bottle flung violently down, and then a rapid pacing athwart the room. Fearing something was the matter, she went to the door and listened, not caring to knock. "I can't go on," he was raving. "I can't go on. 300,000, 400,000, the huge multitude, cheated. All my life it may take me. Patience, patience indeed. Fool, fool." There was a noise of hobnails on the bricks in the bar, and Mrs. Hall had very reluctantly to leave the rest of his soliloquy. When she returned, the room was silent again, save for the faint crepitation of his chair and the occasional clink of a bottle. It was all over. The stranger had resumed work. When she took in his tea, she saw broken glass in the corner of the room, under the concave mirror, and a golden stain that had been carelessly wiped. She called attention to it. "Put it down in the bill," snapped her visitor. "For God's sake, don't worry me. If there's damage done, put it down in the bill." And he went on, ticking a list in the exercise book before him. "I'll tell you something," said Therinside mysteriously. It was late in the afternoon, and they were in the little beer shop of Ipping Hanger. "Well," said Teddy Henfrey, "this chap you're speaking of, what my dog bit, well, He's black, leastways his legs are. I seed through the tear of his trousers and the tear of his glove. You'd have expected a sort of pinky to show, wouldn't you? Well, there wasn't none, just blackness. I tell you, he's as black as my hat. My sakes, said Henfrey, it's a rummy case altogether. Why, his nose is as pink as paint. That's true, said Ferenside. I knows that, and I'll tell yous what I'm thinking. That man's a piebald, Teddy. Black here and white there, in patches, and he's ashamed of it. He's a kind of half-breed, and the colours come off patchy instead of mixing. I've heard of such things before, and it's the common way with horses, as anyone can see. Chapter 4, Mr. Cuss interviews the stranger. I have told the circumstances of the stranger's arrival in Ipping with a certain fullness of detail in order that the curious impression he created may be understood by the reader. But excepting two odd incidents, the circumstances of his stay until the extraordinary day of the club festival may be passed over very cursorily. There were a number of skirmishes with Mrs. Hall on matters of domestic discipline, but in every case until late April, when the first signs of penury began, he overrode her by the easy expedient of an extra payment. Hall did not like him, and whenever he dared, he talked of the advisability of getting rid of him, but he showed his dislike chiefly by concealing it ostentatiously and avoiding his visitor as much as possible. Wait until the summer, said Mrs. Hall sagely, when the artists are beginning to come, then we'll see. He may be a bit overbearing, but bills settled punctual is bills settled punctual, whatever you'd like to say. The stranger did not go to church, and indeed made no difference between Sunday and the irreligious days, even in costume. He worked, as Mrs. Hall thought, very fitfully. Some days he would come down early and be continuously busy. On others he would rise late, pace his room, fretting audibly for hours together, smoke, sleep in the armchair by the fire. Communication with the world beyond the village he had none. His temper continued very uncertain. For the most part, his manner was that of a man suffering under the most unendurable provocation, and once or twice things were snapped, torn, crushed, or broken in spasmodic gusts of violence. He seemed to be under a chronic irritation of the greatest intensity. His habit of talking to himself in a low voice grew steadily upon him, but though Mrs. Hall listened conscientiously, she could make neither head nor tail of what she heard. He rarely went abroad by daylight, but at twilight he would go out, muffled up invisibly, whether the weather were cold or not, and he chose the loneliest paths and those most overshadowed by trees and banks. His goggling spectacles and ghastly bandaged face under the penthouse of his hat came with disagreeable suddenness out of the darkness upon one or two home-going labourers, and Teddy Henfrey, stumbling out of the scarlet coat one night at 9:30, was scared shamefully by the stranger's skull-like head he was walking, hat in hand, lit by the sudden light of the opened inn door. Such children as saw him at nightfall dreamt of bogies, and it seemed doubtful whether he disliked boys more than they disliked him, or the reverse, but there was certainly a vivid enough dislike on either side. It was inevitable that a person of so remarkable an appearance and bearing should form a frequent topic in such a village as Ipping. Opinion was greatly divided about his occupation. Mrs. Hall was sensitive on the point. When questioned, she explained very carefully that he was an experimental investigator, going gingerly over the syllables as one who dreads pitfalls. When asked what an experimental investigator was, she would say, with a touch of superiority, that most educated people knew such things as that, and would thus explain that he discovered things. Her visitor had had an accident, she said, which temporarily discolored his face and hands, and being of a sensitive disposition, he was averse to any public notice of the fact. Out of her hearing, there was a view, largely entertained, that he was a criminal, trying to escape from justice by wrapping himself up so as to conceal himself altogether from the eye of the police. This idea sprang from the brain of Mr. Teddy Henfrey. No crime of any magnitude dating from the middle or end of February was known to have occurred. Elaborated in the imagination of Mr. Gould, the probationary assistant in the National School, this theory took the form that the stranger was an anarchist in disguise, preparing explosives, and he resolved to undertake such detective operations as his time permitted. These consisted, for the most part, in looking very hard at the stranger whenever they met, or in asking people who had never seen the stranger leading questions about him. But he detected nothing. Another school of opinion followed Mr. Fearenside, and either accepted the piebald view or some modification of it, as, for instance, Silas Durgan, who was heard to assert that if he chooses to show himself at fairs, he'd make his fortune in no time, and being a bit of a theologian, compared the stranger to the man with the one talent. Yet another view explained the entire matter by regarding the stranger as a harmless lunatic. That had the advantage of accounting for everything straight away. Between these main groups were the waverers and compromisers. Sussex folk have few superstitions, and it was only after the events of early April that the thought of the supernatural was first whispered in the village. Even then, it was only credited among the womenfolk. But whatever they thought of him, people in Ipping, on the whole, agreed in disliking him. His irritability, though it might have been comprehensible to an urban brain worker, was an amazing thing to these quiet Sussex villagers. The frantic gesticulations they surprised now and then, the headlong pace after nightfall that swept him upon them round quiet corners, the inhuman bludgeoning of all tentative advances of curiosity, the taste for twilight that led to the closing of doors, the pulling down of blinds, the extinction of candles and lamps, who could agree with such goings-on? They drew aside as he passed down the village, and when he had gone by, young humorists would up with coat collars and down with hat brims and go pacing nervously after him in imitation of his occult bearing. There was a song popular at that time called The Bogeyman. Miss Statchell sang it at the schoolroom concert in aid of the church lamps, and thereafter, whenever one or two of the villagers were gathered together and the stranger appeared, a bar or so of this tune, more or less sharp or flat, was whistled in the midst of them. Also, belated little children would call "Bogeyman" after him and make off, tremulously elated. Cuss, the general practitioner, was devoured by curiosity. The bandages excited his professional interest. The report of the 1,001 bottles aroused his jealous regard. All through April and May, he coveted an opportunity of talking to the stranger, and at last, toward Whitsuntide, he could stand it no longer, but hit upon the subscription list for a village nurse as an excuse. He was surprised to find that Mr. Hall did not know his guest's name. "He gave a name," said Mrs. Hall, an assertion which was quite unfounded, "but I didn't rightly hear it." She thought it seemed so silly not to know the man's name. Cuss rapped at the parlor door and entered. There was a fairly audible imprecation from within.
"Oh, what is it?"
"Pardon my intrusion," said Cuss, and then the door closed and cut Mrs. Hall off from the rest of the conversation. She could hear the murmur of voices for the next 10 minutes, then a cry of surprise, a stirring of feet, a chair flung aside, a bark of laughter, quick steps to the door, and Cuss appeared, his face white, his eyes staring over his shoulder. He left the door open behind him, and without looking at her, strode across the hall and went down the steps, and she heard his feet hurrying along the road. He carried his hat in his hand. She stood behind the door, looking at the open door of the parlor, and she heard the stranger laughing quietly, and then his footsteps came across the room. She could not see his face where she stood. The parlor door slammed, and the place was silent again. Cuss went straight up the village to Bunting the vicar. "Am I mad?" Cuss began abruptly as he entered the shabby little study. "Do I look like an insane person?" "What's happened?" said the vicar, putting the ammonite on the loose sheets of his forthcoming sermon. "That chap at the inn." "Well?" "Give me something to drink," said Cuss, and he sat down. When his nerves had been steadied by a glass of cheap sherry, the only drink the good vicar had available, he told him of the interview he had just had. "Went in," he gasped, "and began to demand a subscription for that nurse fund. He'd stuck his hands in his pockets as I came in, and he sat down lumpily in his chair, sniffed. I told him I'd heard he took an interest in scientific things. He said yes, sniffed again, kept on sniffing all the time, evidently recently caught an infernal cold. No wonder wrapped up like that. I developed the nurse idea and all the while kept my eyes open. Bottles, chemicals everywhere, balance, test tubes in stands, and a smell of evening primrose. Would he subscribe? Said he'd consider it. Asked him point blank, was he researching? Said he was. A long research? Got quite cross. A damnable long research, said he, blowing the cork out, so to speak. Oh, said I, and out came the grievance. The man was just on the boil, and my question boiled him over. He had been given a prescription, most valuable prescription. What for, he wouldn't say. Was it medical? Damn you, what are you fishing after? I apologized, dignified sniff and cough. He resumed. He'd read it. 5 ingredients, put it down, turned his head. Draught of air from window lifted the paper. Swish, rustle. He was working in a room with an open fireplace, he said. Saw a flicker, and there was the prescription burning and lifting chimneyward. Rushed towards it, just as it whisked up the chimney. So, just at that point, to illustrate his story, out came his arm. Well? No hand, just an empty sleeve. Lord, I thought, that's a deformity. Got a cork arm, I suppose, and has taken it off. Then, I thought, there's something odd in that. What the devil keeps that sleeve up and open if there's nothing in it? There was nothing in it, I tell you. Nothing down it, right down to the joint. I could see right down to the elbow, and there was a glimmer of light shining through a tear in the cloth. Good God, I said. Then he stopped, stared at me with those black goggles of his, and then at his sleeve. Well, that's all. He never said a word, just glared and put his sleeve back in his pocket quickly. I was saying, said he, that there was the prescription burning, wasn't I? Interrogative cough. How the devil, said I, can you move an empty sleeve like that? Empty sleeve? Yes, said I, an empty sleeve. It's an empty sleeve, is it? You saw it as an empty sleeve? He stood up right away. I stood up too. He came towards me in 3 very slow steps and stood quite close, sniffed venomously. I didn't flinch, though I'm hanged if that bandaged knob of his and those blinkers aren't enough to unnerve anyone coming quietly up to you. You said it was an empty sleeve, he said. Certainly, I said. At staring and saying nothing, a bare-faced man, unspectacled, starts scratch. And then, very quietly, he pulled his sleeve out of his pocket again and raised his arm towards me as though he would show it to me again. He did it very, very slowly. I looked at it. Seemed an age. Well, said I, clearing my throat, there's nothing in it. Had to say something. I was beginning to feel frightened. I could see right down it. He extended it straight towards me, slowly, slowly, just like that, until the cuff was 6 inches from my face. Queer thing to see an empty sleeve come at you like that, and then, well, something exactly like a finger and thumb, it felt, nipped my nose. Bunting began to laugh. There wasn't anything there, said Cuss, his voice running up into a shriek at the there. It's all very well for you to laugh, but I tell you I was so startled I hit his cuff hard and turned round and cut out of the room. I left him... Cuss stopped. There was no mistaking the sincerity of his panic. He turned round in a helpless way and took a second glass of the excellent vicar's very inferior sherry. When I hit his cuff, said Cuss, I tell you, it felt exactly like hitting an arm. And there wasn't an arm. There wasn't the ghost of an arm. Mr. Bunting thought it over. He looked suspiciously at Cuss. It's a most remarkable story, he said. He looked very wise and grave indeed. It's really, said Mr. Bunting, with judicial emphasis, a most remarkable story. Chapter 5. The Burglary at the Vicarage. The facts of the burglary at the vicarage came to us chiefly through the medium of the vicar and his wife. It occurred in the small hours of Whit Monday, the day devoted in Ipping to the club festivities. Mrs. Bunting, it seems, woke up suddenly in the stillness that comes before the dawn with the strong impression that the door of their bedroom had opened and closed. She did not arouse her husband at first, but sat up in bed, listening. She then distinctly heard the pad, pad, pad of bare feet coming out of the adjoining dressing room and walking along the passage toward the staircase. As soon as she felt assured of this, she aroused the Reverend Mr. Bunting as quietly as possible. He did not strike a light, but putting on his spectacles, her dressing gown, and his bath slippers, he went out on the landing to listen. He heard, quite distinctly, a fumbling going on at his study desk downstairs, and then a violent sneeze. At that, he returned to his bedroom, armed himself with the most obvious weapon, the poker, and descended the staircase as noiselessly as possible. Mrs. Bunting came out on the landing. The hour was about 4, and the ultimate darkness of the night was past. There was a faint shimmer of light in the hall, but the study doorway yawned impenetrably black. Everything was still except the faint creaking of the stairs under Mr. Bunting's tread and the slight movements in the study. Then something snapped. The drawer was opened, and there was a rustle of papers. Then came an imprecation, and a match was struck, and the study was flooded with yellow light. Mr. Bunting was now in the hall, and through the crack in the door he could see the desk and the open drawer, and a candle burning on the desk. But the robber he could not see. He stood there in the hall, undecided what to do, and Mrs. Bunting, her face white and intent, crept slowly downstairs after him. One thing kept Mr. Bunting's courage, the persuasion that this burglar was a resident in the village. They heard the chink of money and realized that the robber had found the housekeeping reserve of gold, £2.10 in half sovereigns altogether. At that sound, Mr. Bunting was nerved to abrupt action. Gripping the poker firmly, he rushed into the room, closely followed by Mrs. Bunting. "Surrender!" cried Mr. Bunting fiercely, and then stooped, amazed. Apparently, the room was perfectly empty. Yet, their conviction that they had, that very moment, heard somebody moving in the room had amounted to a certainty. For half a minute, perhaps, they stood gaping. Then Mrs. Bunting went across the room and looked behind the screen, while Mr. Bunting, by a kindred impulse, peered under the desk. Then Mrs. Bunting turned back to the window curtains, and Mr. Bunting looked up the chimney and probed it with the poker. Then Mrs. Bunting scrutinized the waste paper basket. Then they came to a stop and stood with eyes interrogating each other. "I could have sworn," said Mr. Bunting. "The candle," said Mr. Bunting. "Who lit the candle?" "The drawer," said Mrs. Bunting. "And the money's gone." She went hastily to the doorway. "Of all the strange occurrences." There was a violent sneeze in the passage. They rushed out, and as they did so, the kitchen door slammed. "Bring the candle," said Mr. Bunting, and led the way. They both heard a sound of bolts being hastily shot back. As he opened the kitchen door, he saw through the scullery that the back door was just opening, and the faint light of early dawn displayed the dark masses of the garden beyond. He is certain that nothing went out the door. It opened, stood open for a moment, and then closed with a slam. As it did so, the candle Mrs. Bunting was carrying from the study flickered and flared. It was a minute or more before they entered the kitchen. The place was empty. They refastened the back door, examined the kitchen, pantry, and scullery thoroughly, and at last went down into the cellar. There was not a soul to be found in the house, search as they would. Daylight found the vicar and his wife, a quaintly costumed little couple, still marveling about on their own ground floor by the unnecessary light of a guttering candle. Chapter 6. The Furniture That Went Mad. Now it happened that in the early hours of Whit Monday, before Milly was hunted out for the day, Mr. Hall and Mrs. Hall both rose and went noiselessly down into the cellar. Their business there was of a private nature, and had something to do with the specific gravity of their beer. They had hardly entered the cellar when Mrs. Hall found she had forgotten to bring down a bottle of sarsaparilla from their joint room. As she was the expert and principal operator in this affair, Hall very properly went upstairs for it. On the landing, he was surprised to see that the stranger's door was ajar. He went on into his own room and found the bottle as he had been directed. But, returning with the bottle, he noticed that the bolts of the front door had been shot back, that the door was in fact simply on the latch. It was with a flash of inspiration that he connected this with the stranger's room upstairs and the suggestions of Mr. Teddy Henfrey. He distinctly remembered holding the candle while Mrs. Hall shot these bolts overnight. At the sight, he stopped, gaping, then, with the bottle still in his hand, went upstairs again. He rapped at the stranger's door. There was no answer. He rapped again, then pushed the door wide open and entered. It was as he expected. The bed, the room also, was empty, and what was stranger, even to his heavy intelligence, on the bedroom chair and along the rail of the bed were scattered the garments, the only garments so far as he knew, and the bandages of their guest. His big slouch hat even was cocked jauntily over the bedpost. As Hall stood there,
All right, everyone. I'm gonna call Angela's life tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by. Everyone keep stopping by. I appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.